to do it, recording the call. And so I cleared this with all the panelists, and I just would like to let everyone else know that we will be recording it, and then we'll make it available on our website and Facebook page for political science students, and try to encourage as many people to make it available as widely as possible. So the plan for tonight is quite simple. We have 3 discussants with us, but Jeff has agreed to start us off with his own summary and reflections on the book. Then we will, in the great conference tradition, go in order by name on the flyer. So we have Rob Mickey joining us from the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. We have Betsy Sofer joining us from the Department of History at Columbia University. And Elizabeth Blackmore, oh my God, from the Department of History at Columbia. Sorry, Betsy. I got all thrown off having you say Betsy instead of Elizabeth, so, you know. Anyway, and Jonathan Sofer joining us from the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at New York University. So once Jeff has spoken for about 10 minutes, each panelist will take about 10 minutes, and we're gonna have plenty of time for discussion. And so once we start the discussion, I think we'll try using the hand raising signal, though I would encourage everyone not to be too formal. We're not a huge group, and we want discussion to flow, of course. And I'll slow things down if you get too wild and crazy, so don't worry about that. And again, feel free to drop questions into the chat. Kun and I will both be monitoring the chat and the hand raises and doing our best. And if you just wave your hands around or just yell at us, then we'll recognize you if we're missing anyone. Don't be shy. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. And I will now turn the screen/floor over to Jeff, Dr. Jeff Broxmeyer from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration.
Well, thank you, Renee. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. I just want to thank the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at University of Toledo for hosting this book event, the College of Arts and Letters and Dean Gilbert, also Sam Nelson, who's the chair of the department, for just supporting the project for so long. But Renee, especially for organizing all the details of the event and everything like that. So, and also my sincere gratitude to the panelists for taking time out of their busy schedule to be a part of this book discussion. It's a real act of scholarly generosity, and I appreciate that. So political parties during the Gilded Age were really at the peak of their relevance, mobilizing voters. Can you guys hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So political parties during the Gilded Age were really at the peak of their relevance, mobilizing voters, driving agendas, precisely when the inequality crisis was at its worst. So what's the link? And my book comes at this question from a few vantages, by examining New York during the Gilded Age, from the late 1860s to the 1880s especially. And I look at a top-down vantage with a focus on party leaders, their political practices in accumulating wealth, which I try and lay out in detail. I look bottom up by examining the social history of petty office holding at the bottom of the spoils system, the politically connected poor, as I think of them, who filled a lot of these lower offices in the moment when the mass party system really depended on their labor. And then I look in from the outside. By the turn of the century, electoral capitalism, this way of conducting politics that I'll discuss, had really attracted lots of vocal critics from a whole array of protesters. And I try and look at that and think about what that tells us about how this period worked. Above all, in the book, I try and show that political parties and the major factions that ran them came to be organized around electoral capitalism. And by this, I mean a category of entrepreneurship in which the capture of public office and the accumulation of private wealth were really mutually reinforcing. Party leaders were getting rich. And this at a time when the gap between the rich and the poor was growing to really crisis levels in society. We typically think of capitalism as a process in which money begets greater wealth in a sphere of employers and workers and markets. But I contend with case studies of Tammany Democrats and stalwart Republicans. These are the main governing factions in the period. That the formula for electoral capitalism is really when politics begets wealth. Thomas C. Platt, who is a longtime Republican Party leader in the Gilded Age in New York, said this explicitly in one of his patronage negotiations. He said that he would accept nomination to office, quote, only if I should be satisfied that there's money in it and that no such original outlay of capital is needed. This logic of accumulation really came to dominate the entire party system after the Civil War. The main actors who are accumulating and investing were party leaders. And there are a host of other lesser kind of political figures who are really consequential as well. These included party operators of the second and third rank, people whose names were probably obscure in their own time, but who have been kind of completely forgotten since then. And those are the people who really ran the party banks, who managed the patronage mill, or even lower down made up all of these anonymous partisans who toiled in petty offices that made up the spoil system in the age of mass politics. So what the book tries to demonstrate then is that one of the defining features of the Gilded Age was how political parties sought to generate a surplus that could be widely shared, the way in which that surplus was directly connected to internal party markets for patronage positions, and how this way of doing business really precipitated a popular reaction in the form of mass protests, crystallizing all sorts of reform proposals, most of which never were enacted, but show something of a critique of the party system as a whole. The first half of the book examines how party leaders innovated a host of wealth accumulating practices that are really fascinating. They created novel institutions that made themselves into significant investors of both party activity and business ventures. And a good example of this is the way that Tammany Democrats and stalwart Republicans conjured up political finance to serve party ends, but also to make themselves rich. As I show in chapter 1, Tammany Hall builds this vibrant financial sector during the late 1860s and early 1870s, during the height of the Tweed Ring, which governed New York by embezzling millions of dollars of public money. Control over a network of savings and commercial banks, in most cases chartered by Tammany Hall, but in all cases run by them, was really central to William Boss Tweed's ambition to reshape the post-Civil War political landscape, bringing to power a coalition of laborers and Catholics and immigrants in the city. These savings banks especially were chartered by the state legislature. They were propped up with city deposits and money from Catholic charities and from the earnings of common laborers, who were really encouraged to embrace the values of thrift by saving a portion of their wages in these politically controlled banks. Their names were the Bowling Green, the Guardian, the National Savings, the Yorkville Bank. Then there were the commercial banks like the 10th National, which was a broker's bank. And that allowed Boss Tweed to move cash and checks back and forth from his savings banks to Wall Street and also to a whole host of political activities. And the officers of that bank as well were all members of the Tweed Ring. Nearly all of these financial institutions collapse when the ring was thrown out of power. As I note in the book, one of the very first acts of the anti-Tweed reformers when they get a foothold in city government is to precipitate a bank run by withdrawing really just a small amount of city funds from one bank, and it just kind of leads to a bank run on all of them. Now, party finance was also central to the organization of the stalwart faction of the Republicans in this period, which governed New York in the decade after the collapse of the Tweed Ring. For the stalwart Republicans, the main institution was really a firm called Morton Bliss and Company, which established itself through patronage that was doled out by the presidential administration of Ulysses S. Grant. Morton Bliss and Company secured the right to transfer federal money abroad for diplomatic purposes and also to pay salaries in the Navy. The faction, which had been organized originally out of the custom house in the New York port, used its influence to make Morton Bliss and Company the lead fiscal agent with authority to market US government bonds, which gave them a huge commission. But also the firm becomes basically a kind of de facto government-backed bank that leverages that privileged position to attract lucrative business from European investors. And what you see in the company records and the correspondence is fascinating. The firm's partners are talking on the one hand with captains of industry, negotiating with Andrew Carnegie and Jay Gould over things like the price of iron and coal. But then on the other hand, they're debating party conventions and platforms, nominations for office. In particular, they're especially lobbying Congress on monetary policy. They were gold bugs in this era of the great monetary debates. And Morton Bliss and Company really launches the career of Levi Morton, who's one of the named partners. And one of the reasons why he rises so quickly to the top of the political system is that his firm is the principal source of financial services for the Republican office-holding elite. Members of the House of Representatives, senators, military officials, their families are being serviced through this institution, including most of the major figures who are the heads of the factions at the time. When Morton is ready to retire, the firm was actually bought up and it merged into JP Morgan's empire, which I think is an interesting contrast to the fate of the Tammany banks, which virtually disappear. So the first part of the book is about the peak of the party system, major leaders and party managers. The rest of the book tries to look beyond high politics, starting with the spoil system by taking a look at the bottom up and asking what was it like for petty office holders and what did they want out of the political activity they were involved in. And what I'm talking about here are the street sweepers, the messengers, the clerks, the weighers, the doormen, the inspectors, the washroom attendants, the political appointees, who were really performing a lot of the, as James Bryce refers to it, the dull and toilsome work of election politics in this age. I think of these appointees as the office-holding crowd, because there really always was a reserve army of labor at ready for party managers to select from. What becomes clear, going through patronage correspondence, which is a lot of fun, sometimes depressing, is that the lower spoil system in this historical period had really developed an ancillary goal, along with electoral conquest of protecting the vulnerable in society. And this I call partisan poor relief, because you can see this groundswell of demands for relief that's bubbling up in this correspondence. There are all sorts of needs-based claims for relief that are cited, like bankruptcy, business slumps, old age, disability, widower status, health crisis, family dependence, all sorts of other forms of extreme hardship. But in their own language, what these petty office seekers wanted was a situation. That's the way in which they referred to it. And that was, they wanted a modestly better life, or perhaps maintenance of the status quo, or some kind of cushion to deal with difficult personal circumstances that had arisen. So the shuffling of needy men and women into unnecessary or more comfortable or even phantom work, which is a kind of quintessential aspect of the spoil system, really also I think has to be thought of as a kind of party-led form of social protection that emerges in the period. So what about the reaction to this? What about the reaction to party consolidation in this period? And the last portion of the book looks in from the outside, because in the 1880s, there is a period of intensive social movement activity, sometimes referred to as the Great Upheaval. And I think of this as reform from below. People who were involved in mass demonstrations or protests or strikes or boycotts of various kinds. They're establishing newspapers that don't last very long, things like this. And these are people who held no formal major party posts or public offices, who inherited no fortunes, in stark contrast to elite reformers in the period. But this grassroots reform camp had a few things in common. They generally flew under the banner of anti-monopoly, and they spoke in that language. They were principally concerned with improving living conditions, not surprising because they were pretty desperate in a lot of cases. And they sought really to, you can see in these diverse array of proposals, to fundamentally try and decommodify politics by restructuring this link that had been established between public office and capitalism. And the proposals that circulate really go far beyond the merit system for civil service, which was the main idea of elite reformers of the day. Grassroots reform ideas really varied from pie in the sky to some very, very practical ones. And I don't have time to get into them here, But I'll just note that ideas like using the referendum to try and completely circumvent public officials in decision-making comes out of this moment. There's a lively debate about whether to radically abolish all unnecessary offices that are kind of fueling the patronage army, or on the other hand, radically enlarge the public domain so that office holders would, quote, superintend our factories, groceries, and bake and meat shops, because that would be better than what some thought they were currently experiencing. There are also platform proposals that kind of echoed the radical phase of Reconstruction in the South to disenfranchise party leaders and bar them from office where they had perhaps engaged in corruption or fraud of some kind. Proposals to radically reduce public salaries with the idea that this money was basically going to finance the party organizations as a form of party capital. And then some really interesting campaigns to try and pressure employers to recognize trade unions by leveraging these public subsidies from the parties to, say, for instance, newspapers especially. A series of printers unions try this tactic in the 1880s to try and basically kind of expand who benefits from the largesse of patronage. Let me just conclude briefly with a few thoughts. This book is bounded within the Gilded Age and limited really to one state's experience, but panning outward, I want to suggest that capital accumulation and how it shapes and patterns political institutions is really a theme that's ripe for the study of political development more generally. I think the fusion of capital and office holding is going to look differently from time to time and from place to place, probably according to regime type, according to institutional matrix, historical legacy, popular attitudes, and things like that. But it's perhaps a good meeting of, say, trends in the new history of capitalism that might be brought productively into dialogue with American political development. And then secondly, I also hope that we can place this book in the context of debates about party formation and some really kind of classic questions of party formation, like why do political parties form? Or what are the kinds of actors that are instrumental to building coalitions? And what makes them sticky? What makes coalitions sticky over the long term? Well, as the book tries to show, going into business with each other and striving to make political allies not only powerful, but also rich, was one way to tie political and economic fates together. And that's a story about coordinating collective action, but it's a story about coordinating capitalist collective action through political parties. And then finally, I just want to add that research in writing this book has made me a bit skeptical about how much we can profess to know about how politics works in practice. So much of high politics that was conducted by party leaders in this period was far beyond view of contemporary voters especially, but even of other political figures and even scholars later on who were looking back. Now, one way to kind of try and disentangle power relations that might otherwise be opaque is to look at the business dealings that undergirded these electoral alliances of these ambitious office holders, office seekers. And that's not an easy thing to do, but trying to systematically look at through the record of, say, second and third tier political operators, these kinds of people who are generally not in the news, can really be very revealing in describing hidden political practices and trying to interpret their meaning within proper historical context. And then with that, I'll just thank you very much for your patience, and I'll hand things back to Renee.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I'm assuming not everyone on the call has read the book, right? So anyway, that was a really great overview and probably extremely helpful for getting people more involved in the discussion after our discussants. We are, again, in the great tradition of conference behavior, going to switch the order of our discussants and invite Betsy Blackmore to go next. So I'm going to turn it over to Betsy. Thank you. You're muted, Betsy, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. And thank you for organizing it. I'm a social historian, and I have always been dependent on the political scientists to bring the state back in. And so I found this a really rich and fresh and original look at party politics in New York in the last third of the 19th century, which had ramifications across the country precisely because of the larger clout of New York party leaders and New York votes. You know, it's interesting to me. I teach a course that's called the First Gilded Age, and the first thing I assign is Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner's novel, some selections from the chapters. And they wrote that book they published it in 1873, and much of it is based on clippings from newspapers. And in a sense, that was the book that gave a kind of revived currency to the charge of political corruption. So one of the things that really interested me about Jeffrey's book was his refusal of the category of corruption. And I think that's a pretty bold move. And that alone is worth the price of admission, to sort of say what we're looking at here is not sort of something that is abnormal. What we're looking at is the creation of norms. And I think the book really shows us how a close analysis of the structures and the institutions of party business lets us understand some very basic common sense propositions that Jeffrey lays out that corruption sort of obscures. It required organizing not simply votes on election day, but a party apparatus and infrastructure to turn out votes year in and year out. That's a common sense, but it requires thinking beyond the buying of individual votes on any given election. It required entrepreneurs, that is, men willing to invest in and manage party organizations, and it required a widely understood logic of the relation of party organizations to the work of governance, both in the public domain, but also in relation to the dominant economic institutions. So I think Jeffrey persuasively shows us how the party system in the late 19th century required adjusting the longstanding sinews of patronage and spoils to the new conditions of finance and corporations that were in the process of consolidating after the Civil War. And although in the introduction, he suggests that money alone can't buy political outcomes, I do think it's by following the money that he is able to show us how political parties themselves necessarily operated as business institutions and financial arrangements. And he does this by zeroing in on these different episodes. And I just want to say, as a historian, for those of you in political science, he has uncovered stuff that the historians have simply missed. So I want to highlight a couple of episodes that I found particularly interesting in terms of rethinking the structures of political power in New York in the 19th century. One of them is this attention to the Tammany banks and the ways in which the party organized financial institutions, especially savings banks, to basically underwrite both the massive public investment that was taking place as part of the Growth Coalition in the aftermath of the Civil War in New York City. And at the same time, also, as he shows, enhancing the private fortunes and powers of the party leaders. But I think what's especially noteworthy about this attention to the Tammany banks is that Jeffrey's uncovered both the complicity of the established financial institutions, their willingness to go along with the Tammany banks, the leading commercial banks, Wall Street and the Clearinghouse, and also the fears of competition from especially the immigrant savings banks that had been a channel for upward mobility and political influence for Irish Americans who are not fully incorporated under the wing of Tammany. And in a sense, what he shows is that the threat of Tammany's banks capturing funds, for example, from the very substantial Catholic charities like the Sisters Charity, represented a sort of a real change in where the immigrant community was positioned within the city's political economy, and that this was part of what, in a sense, the coalition that brought down the Tammany banking system. It wasn't just the capital strike of the Committee of 70, which was the leading businessmen in the city who were afraid that the city couldn't meet the interest on its municipal bonds. But indeed it was, and this is part of the larger theme of the book, the sort of tension between entrepreneurialism and the response to entrepreneurialism's competitiveness of trying to move towards monopoly, that it was basically the mainstream banks that were trying to reestablish their monopoly, and also their relation with this sort of substrata of established savings banks that point us to the importance of the nonprofit sector as part of this story of 19th century capitalism. It's a theme he also sounds in an examination of the Lenox Library. And I just like the way it reaches and incorporates the multiple institutions that went together in basically forming an infrastructure of party power, or the coalitions that challenged party power. So I also want to say that historians have looked a lot at Tammany. They haven't seen everything that Jeffrey's uncovered, but it really was refreshing to me to see him take apart the New York's Republican Party and show me how the factions of Conkling and Thomas Platt and Levy Morton operated their own system of party organizing to preserve their own power and wealth, using some of the same tactics, but going well beyond the conventional understanding of, say, the party system resting on the waving of the bloody flag of the Civil War. So I thought that that was also a real important contribution. I think that historians have long looked at Tammany as a parallel welfare institution in 19th century New York. But again, what Jeffrey shows is that the Republican Party also operated their own patronage welfare system through the Customs House. And the sort of takeaway here is, I don't think it's a sort of Poyani argument about the need for social protection. I think it is an argument about the incorporation of voters that was absolutely necessary to the way the party system worked. But it also, there's an interesting wrinkle in this in my mind, which is that when Tammany expanded public works in New York in the late 1860s, one of the things they did was establish the 8-hour day for public workers, and also raised the wages of unskilled public workers above the market rate. And that's an important backdrop to the ways in which the labor coalition, the labor component, was not simply that it was having an impact on an idea of public policy in the sense that the claim was the public sector had to set the standards for the private sector in terms of employment. That move was lost with the financial panic of 1873 and with the depression that followed, and especially with the fiscal retrenchment. And it's a backdrop to understanding the revival of the labor movement in the 1880s that Jeffrey foregrounds as a challenge to the party system. But I think that the sort of critical in-between moment is in fact the fiscal crisis. So one of my questions for Jeffrey is how we think about where fiscal politics figures in the story of party politics. C.K. Yearley's old version of this was that basically it was middle-class taxpayers who challenged Tammany rule, and that to do so, they basically, in order to starve the party, that is to cut off its patronage, they starved the state. In other words, it's not just a story of elite party leaders in competition, nor the recipients of their jobs, but this more ambiguously situated middling class that also, I think, is a grassroots formation that was driven by interest. And I'm interested in trying to think about this, what happens in your sort of framework, Jeffrey, to the idea of interest, and particularly those constituencies that are brought into votes that challenge party rule and challenge party monopoly, are brought into fusion movements that were so common in late 19th century New York, out of a different kind of interest, that they aren't in the reward system. They're not accumulating, but they object to the use of public employment and to basically support the party system as they see it at the expense of taxpayers. So let me just very quickly raise a couple of other questions. You offer a very powerful analysis of the way in which, using the Typographers Union's challenge to the Republican Party's masthead in the Tribune, the way in which organized labor challenged the authority of the Republican Party. And it's a really original and fascinating account. But I wanted to ask you, in thinking about that move, which is all taking place before 1886, the counterfactual question is, what would have happened if Haymarket had not happened? In other words, the Haymarket bombing incident in 1886 basically devastated the Knights of Labor. It really cut off the 8-hour movement. And most importantly, it pushed the AFL unions away from any connection to electoral politics and party politics. And so in a sense, it seems to me that there's a fuller story to be told about when labor could use the party system to gain a voice, and when labor turned away. And the question I have is, how do we think about then both parties, in a sense, more aggressively aligning themselves, arguably with capital in the 1890s? So it's a question about the ways in which the vulnerabilities of this party system. And you can think about the South, and you can think about, I mean, one thing that your chapter on Tammany and the savings banks made me think about was the failure of the Freedmen's Saving Bank. But if you look at the South in the 1890s, the Bourbon Democrats basically, when challenged by the Farmers Alliance and the Populists, used direct force, promoted lynching and disenfranchisement to cut off that threat. And it seems to me it's trickier to understand how the parties responded to the pressure of social movements in the North in this period. And I think it's worth, I hope you write another book that sort of picks it up in 1890s and takes us through to 1919, because the story gets messier and messier in terms of the inability of the party entrepreneurs to hold in a firm way their control over the party system. So let me just end with both commending you on the modesty of the claims of this book. I, as a historian, completely agree that we can only follow this model in its specificity in particular times and places, and it requires this kind of archival digging to understand how party politics actually worked on the ground. I'm interested in the group discussing some of the propositions you end with. Basically, you make the argument that democracy needs strong parties. And then you suggest that it's not possible to build strong parties in purportedly democratic capitalist political economy without capital, without long-term investments. And in that sense, it seems to me that the story you're telling is that the market logic has so completely penetrated the political economy that politics can't, in a sense, offer, in Polanyi's terms, a field of protection. That basically, this is a pretty sobering book for trying to think about contemporary political capitalism, how it works and how it might be rendered accountable. I appreciate that you don't go there, but that's where your reader goes. Your reader ends this book really confronted with the question of what would it take for a democratic electoral process to work through a party system that did not take as its premise capitalist strategies of accumulation and ultimately, you could sort of say, exploitation through the denial of recognition to the democratic constituencies. So I hope I didn't go over. I did. I'm sorry.
That's okay, Betsy. Thank you very much. There's so much rich material there to work with. We're going to turn it over to Jonathan Sofer now from New York University.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to carefully read Jeffrey's really terrific work. I think, I myself came to study political machines because I grew up in the Albany in Albany, New York, during the period of Uncle Dan O'Connell and Erastus Corning. The mayor of Albany, Erastus Corning, was mayor for 14 years when Dick Daley first got elected, and for almost 20 years after he left office, which gives you an idea of the stability of the political machine that I grew up with. And when I first started my own studies of Tammany, I called up a graduate school classmate of mine from Columbia, whose father had actually run against Mayor Corning as a liberal, as a progressive alternative, and said, "Is it true what I heard as kids that the snowplows didn't plow your street because your father ran for mayor?" And she said, "Yes, that was true. And also they tried to get him fired from his law firm." So I think, so I come to this with a sort of sobering perspective about the often profoundly anti-democratic aspects of political machines and of this kind of political entrepreneurship. I think Jeffrey has done us several great services in this book. The phrase electoral capitalism, situating the political entrepreneurship of both parties, because as Betsy pointed out, the Republicans are often neglected. And I confess, as a young kid growing up in Albany, and when I was in high school, I worked in the state assembly for the machine assemblyman, actually, who was quite politically liberal. I used to stop and kind of venerate the bust of Roscoe Conkling that is carved into the staircase of the state capitol. So this book actually meant a great deal to me on a very visceral level. But electoral capitalism is a great phrase, I think, that situates the political entrepreneurship of both parties within this broader emerging field of the history of capitalism. And I actually read it differently from you, Betsy. I actually read Jeffrey, and I hope you'll comment on this as saying that as arguing that the experience of the Gilded Age shows that strongly competitive political parties don't, in fact, and high voter turnout doesn't, in fact, guarantee a healthy democracy. I mean, I read this book as saying that electoral capitalism creates a kind of ossifying effect on the government and on what can be done in society in an age of economic stratification. I think some of the other really big contributions here are, his analysis of electoral capitalism as the default mode of both parties utilizing, quote, governing institutions as a source of investment. And I think that the way he shows the relation between the evolving corporate form, which of course started back in the 1830s as a working class demand for general incorporation, and then slowly evolved into something that provided a great deal less equality than the locofocos who had thought of it initially anticipated. And I also liked his emphasis on anti-monopoly instead of moral reform, and sort of decentering the mugwumps and elite reformers from the narrative of opposition to Tammany. And in fact, I think there's a great deal of counter evidence that there wasn't really all that much opposition on the part of that kind of opposition was somewhat mobile. And finally, I think that the perception of the Henry George movement and the ideas that came out of this is really as the most significant opposition to the machine is a really, as opposed to the elite reformers, is a really, really strong insight. And I think it's going to be supported by scholarship that is coming out including a recent dissertation at NYU by Daniel London that really shows that that whereas we've tended to see Georgism as a flash in the pan of this electoral campaign in the 1880s, that actually George's ideas had a sustained impact on tax policy and property tax policy and development of the outer boroughs well into the 1920s, and that the single tax actually gets kind of in Dan's narrative kind of gets hijacked by New York real estate interests, who were so I think you've really made a really good foundation for additional scholarship developing in this area because of the way you've the new things that you've brought to light. But I do part company a little bit on the question of corruption and the usefulness of corruption, which I think properly defined can be a significant category of analysis, and I'm sort of more with Richard White on this aspect of the question. Certainly Tammany, especially in the wake of the draft riots, used the city budget to maintain social peace. And but other than Jeffrey's keen analysis of Republican patronage, which really is, I think, path-breaking, and it's path-breaking because there really isn't any qualitative analysis, research on how Tammany welfare worked. We really don't know how much there was, who got jobs, how widespread its effects were, who got turkeys at Christmas. I mean, everyone says they handed out turkeys at Christmas, but I don't really see any evidence, certainly not quantifiable evidence of this, and how much flowed in terms of favors, getting your son out of jail, how widespread was this, and how much did this really help out New York's working class? Certainly not everyone felt helped, as you point out in your book very vividly, because there was a significant working class opposition movement to Tammany. As far as corruption, I think there are reasonable standards that, and I looked at my file on corruption of notes on books on corruption, and I couldn't believe how huge it was. But what I've distilled from that is I think that one component is is just on the way about the relative autonomy of the state, or even from common law, the pre-existing duty rule. No official should be allowed to take gratuities for doing their job, or from refraining from doing their job. So I think that is just number one sine qua non of what corruption is. The second thing is that I think equality, and you get at this as well in your analysis of the movements of the 1880s. It's paradoxical, given Roscoe Conkling's famous conspiracy to apply the 14th Amendment to corporations, but I actually think due process and equal protection are important standards of what is corrupt and what is not corrupt. Getting your street plowed shouldn't depend on acquiescence to the local political machine. But it's more than that. I mean, the paradoxical expansion of due process and equal protection to corporations undermined an earlier ethic in the Smithian economy, before corporations were widespread. I'm getting ahead of myself, but the point is that once you go to this corporate form, almost all private profit depends to a much greater extent than previously on diversions or subsidies from the Commonwealth. And so the question is, are these going to be adjudicated by a relatively autonomous state with equity in mind, or are they going to be adjudicated by political parties as a result of unmediated electoral competition, fair or unfair? And in the 1880s, you're talking about also with the disenfranchisement on a national scale of a significant portion of the population, women and African Americans. Finally, we can't ever have perfect equality, but could corruption be defined as a political system that's designed to use governmental power to increase and exacerbate income inequality? And wouldn't electoral capitalism fall into that category? In other words, its purpose is not democracy. Its purpose is to make money for people. The economist Brad DeLong has categorized the ways in which the course of US history, the ways in which one could become a billionaire at different periods of US history, and it's not quite as simple as anti-monopoly. I take them as an operational definition of corruption. Number one is inheritance plus a stock market boom. Number two is being at the right place at the right time, creating an enterprise of truly enormous social utility, I'm quoting DeLong here, and thereafter retaining both the market power to turn a large chunk of that in extra social utility into firm profits, and retaining a sufficient ownership, share, and access to turn those profits into a personal fortune. And you know, that's the sort of Bill Gates, Thomas Edison method. Three, persuading the government to do your enterprise a truly massive favor. And four, being completely and totally corrupt in the sense that you were willing to buy government influence to make yourself rich. That I think is the case of Richard White's railroad billionaires. So, but there are only certain periods of history in which these methods worked. These periods were, according to DeLong, and I think it's underlined also in Piketty's recent book on ideology and capital, the Civil War and Reconstruction, World War I, and the period of, dare I use that much profaned word, neoliberalism, from 1980 to the present. As DeLong observed, the New Deal made it almost impossible to be a billionaire. And for me, that's an anti-corruption ideal. So who's next?
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you. The focus was the great shift to corruption, and that was really interesting. Thank you. Hello, Rob.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Four Corners Landscaping, or whatever it's called.
Four Seasons, yeah.
Four Seasons, all right. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to Rob, and then we'll open the floor.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much for including me in this and giving me the chance not just to discuss this excellent book, but listen to other real experts and soon the audience. I don't have much of a background in 19th century politics and really none in New York. So I'm going to raise a few questions that I'm sure come down not to issues that Jeff's book has, but really come down to my kind of weak understanding of New York in the period. But first, I just want to note a few of the book's really important contributions. So the first for me is, as others have said, this is really a book of how, right? Less a book of causal inference, but really a book of teasing out the mechanics of how Tammany Hall and the stalwarts means of election were gathered, allocated, reinvested, and so on. How leaders used office seeking to make money, even invest their own and party funds through these financial firms and others, really how this was done. You know, some things aren't studied enough, I think, because often it's because we're misled by our faulty ideas to not see them as important as they are. That's partly true with this book, right? There are very few books like Tom Ferguson's Golden Rule on American banking and elections and so on. But but with Jeff's book, the reason why I think we don't really know, haven't really before Jeff's book really understood the hows of Gilded Age elections doesn't just come down to the criminal inattention to political economy among scholars in our subfield of American politics until very, very recently, although I think that's very, very important. And it's something that's only now kind of being redressed because of this belated discovery of growing inequality in the US today. I think that's part of it, but I think the main reason something like Jeff's book hadn't been written before is just that it's so damn hard, right? It's so complicated and difficult to disentangle financial arrangements that the arrangers would prefer to remain obscure, right? And one issue, one kind of a criticism I have of Jeff's book is that he's way too modest in this regard. You don't see Jeff's, I think there's one mention at the beginning of a chapter in a nod to kind of mainstream political science of here's the kinds of evidence I gathered to write this chapter. Those first couple chapters, there's none of that. And so by not really talking about all the research he had to do to tease these things out, he doesn't really communicate, I don't think, nearly clearly enough how difficult this must have been, and therefore what a contribution the book is. He makes it look too easy. The one thing that's good about that is that I hope it'll trick graduate students into building on his work because they think it's doable. Yeah, I would just say that the attention not just to public sector employment, but especially to the Morton Bliss and Company is just really superb. The second contribution, at least for me, and I think that's maybe less true of the other two speakers, but certainly true for me, is the recasting of labor and the anti-monopoly movements as voices of political reform as well. It may sound simple, but certainly from the political science perspective, we're treated with this binary of machines and forces of civil service reform, but Jeff's kind of bottom-up reformers really complicate that, right? And it may seem simple merely to narrate the figure of the petty office seeker and his situation. But again, especially coming from my discipline, long comfortable with these kind of cardboard cutouts of party bosses, it's incredibly powerful to just to hear those voices, right? I think maybe it's, I don't know labor history as well as I should, but I think that there's a similar case to be made for his case study of the Big Six boycott as well. I'd actually love to see him in future work kind of draw out more some of the conclusions from that chapter for thinking about 19th century democratization, something he raises in his conclusion. The third contribution that's the third one I'll mention, there are many more, is just his engagement with the debate about political parties today among scholars of American politics, a debate that's kind of interesting, but that's gotten stale really quickly for those of you who aren't subjected to the discipline, a debate about really kind of who's driving the bus in American parties. Is it still the office seekers and party leaders who are kind of dominating the means of election, the control of nominations, what parties stand for, et cetera, or is it instead organized interests? Again, I find it a very useful debate when I'm teaching first years for teaching undergraduates, but in terms of research, it's not really as subtle as it could be, right? I think it's really important to note, as he does, that scholars in these debates don't really embrace enough Anthony Downs' call to see parties as teams of people whose interests Downs is completely agnostic about, but which Downs says include wealth accumulation, right? So in this first very cynical portrayal of parties by post-World War II political science, they actually, at least Anthony Downs, the founder of this view, did kind of focus on wealth accumulation as a motive, but as Jeff notes, that really drops out. So Jeff is really, by tracing these efforts of wealth accumulation, is redressing the balance. And I think it's notable that, and he footnoted a piece he wrote about Trump that I definitely need to read, but it's welcome, I think, that there's this new attention in Trump's presidential campaigns and his administration to think of them as grift machines, which in one sense they really were. But I think it's, we need to go past that. People who talk about that are kind of stuck a little bit here. I'm maybe in between the other speakers on the usefulness of Jeff's really full-throated rejection of corruption. Not even like, I don't want to get into the normative debate of whether I'm pro or anti-corruption, but really his refusal to use the concept even in a non-normative way. I think that's really welcome. I think it's bracing, and I think it's welcome in the way in thinking about the role of money in politics today, because again, all this attention to Trump's campaigns and his administration, his continuing fundraising efforts since November, right? Many untold millions of dollars for what I'm not sure, right? A lot, that attention is welcome, but I think it obscures the broader sense in which both parties' efforts at winning elections kind of create their own kind of political economy of consultants and pollsters and this whole machine that seems to go of itself in a very different way than Jeff narrates with respect to the Gilded Age, but which has some resonances. I guess I would want to hear more here about how the goals of the office seekers in the Gilded Age actually did interact with the goals of these people or these party leaders as people staking party positions and as staking out an ideology, right? I think there's, again, in American political science, a too easy view to think of machine politics as non-ideological, which is ridiculous, right? But that said, what does their wealth accumulation have to do? How does it shape their call for their party to stand for some things and not others? And that gets dropped out a little bit in his book. One thing that again, the other speakers have I gone too far, Renee? Okay. That I'd like some more help in understanding is really what's distinctive about the Gilded Age's electoral capitalism. And here, I wasn't sure what to get out of this phrase. I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't sure what's really unique here. Jeff does a really good job of showing what's innovative about electoral capitalism in the post-Civil War period relative to Jacksonian spoils, right? Very innovative with respect to financial firms, with the use of public works and so on, instead of just merely selling offices. But I'm thinking, I'm actually skipping the 19th century now, doing a lot of work on the 17th century, and I'm seeing really a lot of continuity throughout American political history in the kind of twinned nature of office seeking, market making, and wealth accumulation. Certainly in the colonial period, the people who are running for offices, actually the people who are deciding what offices there are to run for, are themselves are in charge of land distribution, allocation, reallocation, land sales, and so on. So some of this seems maybe what's distinctive in American party history is the Jacksonian period, and maybe there's continuity besides that. I'm not sure. I was also wondering, again, Jeff was very careful to say, look, I'm not making broader claims about all American parties. I know New York City is unrepresentative in lots of ways, and I respect that, and I was glad he said that. I'm still wondering why this story occurred in New York and not elsewhere. right? Is it a matter of New York City's centrality in financial markets? Is it about the city's business interests having a greater taste for public works and thus making available kind of more linkages between office holders, public finance, and personal wealth? I'm not sure. I think, you know, one place, if Jeff wants to continue working in this vein, there's some interesting comparisons to be made, maybe not explicitly empirical work for him to do, but theoretical and implicit comparisons, not with the US, but with other countries. So I'm thinking of Argentina and these really sophisticated markets of vote buying and selling. I'm also thinking of contemporary China. So one of my colleagues, Yuan Ong, has this fascinating new book called, I think it's called China's Gilded Age, right? Where she's narrating something very similar to Jeff, right? A period of massive economic growth that is in large part state directed, but in large part motivated by the wealth accumulation incentives of office seekers and office holders, right? One final thing I'm kind of wondering about too, Jeff's not, and I'm not sure what I would say either, but I don't think Jeff's sure what he thinks is the impact of the Gilded Age party politics. He discusses the impact of this on inequality. There are times at which he suggests that he's helping to explain the high levels of economic inequality in this first Gilded Age. At other times, especially with his work on poor relief, it almost seems like, well, no, you could think of it in the opposite way, right? That the parties are actually, at least locally, maybe not nationally, locally, in the absence of a welfare state, providing some of its own, right? Which points in a very different direction. I think that Conkling's role in Santa Clara is interesting, but I don't think pointing to that is nearly enough in kind of helping us think about, is there a causal relationship here with levels of inequality? Let me just skip ahead a little bit. Finally, some more questions for Jeff, and Jeff has a really interesting conclusion where he raises some of this, but I'd like maybe to hear more from him either tonight or in future work, a little bit more about what he thinks the legacies of the Gilded Age party politics are, right? There's not, for an APD scholar, he's not offering what the rest of us often offer, which is a way too strong and confident set of claims about the legacies created by the thing that we think of as so important that we've narrated. Jeff is much more careful and modest about that, but still in all, I'd like to hear him say more about how this shaped New York City party politics, national party development, something, right? As he notes, we know a lot more about the collapse of Tammany Hall than we do about its workings, but I also wonder if, given all that Jeff's taught us about how it's worked, does that lead him to have a different account of its decline? I'm not sure, but it'd be interesting to hear him talk about that. I'm seeing, I don't know if he's still here, but Jack Santucci, a political scientist, was on the call earlier. Jack's an expert at municipal election reform, election law reform, and so on. I kind of wondered too whether there were legacies of this period for New York City's very unique, not just set of cross-party alliances, but unique set of electoral laws that allow a very different and multiple kind of party politics than we see in the rest of the country. But certainly Jeff doesn't provide, again, a too confident kind of counterfactual of imagine American party development in the absence of what he calls the party noir of the late 19th century. But I'd like him to kind of argue past his data and maybe suggest one. Just to sum up, I'm not sure that the history of capitalism is actually the best place for him to continue to engage with history as a discipline. Betsy gives us lots of reasons to think about social history, but I also think there are places where he could engage more with kind of historical American and historical comparative political economy, and even with kind of narrower American economic historians like John J. Wallace, people who've worked a lot on elections and public finance, and also on instability, right? One of the things that kind of that surprised me about this book was I thought he was going to be talking about these really durable and enduring relationships, but interestingly, these things are pretty unstable, right? The banks don't last for long. The stalwarts domination doesn't last for long. There's a fragility here, and maybe that's more, that gives him even more reason to tie in this kind of party fragility with, I don't know, the fragility, the instability of a business cycle or something, I'm not sure. One thing I would just note in closing for people who haven't read the book, Jeff does something great at the end in the acknowledgements, is he's brave enough to tell us all the chapters that were left on the cutting room floor, right? And he teases us with some really interesting sounding chapters, including chapters that would really wrestle with racial divisions in New York City and others. So if he wants to tell us what those chapters would have said or will say in his second book, I'd love to hear that too. With that, I'm finally going to shut up. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of the discussants. You've given just an extraordinary amount to work with, and I'm using my prerogative, but also I did ask Jeff first if it was okay, since we're now at 7:20, if we go ahead and open the floor, because we have such a diverse crowd here and so many different ways of thinking about this, that I'd love to get some more ideas on the floor. And then, you know, as we move along, I'm sure that Jeff will have some responses to the extraordinary number of questions that have been raised in light of his work. I'm not sure, I'm using an old version of Zoom apparently. So that's why the raise hand thing isn't there, which is very strange, but that's what I hear. And so you might have the raise hand on your Zoom interface, but I don't. So what I'm going to suggest is that you just type a little me into the chat and it will come up with your name on it. And Kun and I can sort of monitor who's next through the chat instead of through the raised hand. And I had a particular request, or an early request, from Dr. Grossman at Albion College. And so I'm going to let him kick off our discussion period.
I think I taught a class with mute on. I almost did it again. First of all, I just wanted to say
Notice, Andy, I don't want to get too sad here or anything, but.
Okay, but no, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and especially to you, Renee, for inviting me to this. Really, it's been a long time since I've been able to sit in a meeting like this with folks that are interested in sort of the same things I am. So, and to Professor Broxmeyer, thank you. I haven't read your book, so I'm going to go and ask some questions. Because I haven't read your book, but I will. Perhaps these questions may come across, they might be self-evident, and you can just respond accordingly. So I'm going to make this quick because I know there's more people probably on the queue. The first question I have really, and it was a question that Professor Mickey had brought up actually too, and it has to do with the choice of a core industrial northeastern entrepot city like New York City. A, it supported the Confederacy. B, it's filled with immigrants. Why does it support the Confederacy? Obviously for political economic reasons. It's a shipping city. It ships stuff abroad. It's filled with immigrants many of whom don't speak English, and it's also profoundly racist, as most of the country was at that time, i.e. the riots during the Civil War riots, obviously. So my first question is this. I think it's really interesting that you talk about Tammany, but in 1883, the Pendleton Act is passed, and that creates the civil service. So I guess one thing has to do with periodization for me. Are you periodizing the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1883, or are you stretching that periodization out past the system of 96, the McKinley period? because it's very clear that Tammany, the banking system collapses when the Pendleton Act begins. I don't know if there's a cause and effect there. That's perhaps something someone else can talk about. But what you get is the regular centralized Northeastern core industrial banks, which are going to side with Bourbon Southerners right up until the 1964 period at the very least, if not continuing. So my first question really is, why New York City? And that leads to something Elizabeth said, and that has to do with region and section. I'm a student of Richard Bensel, so sectionalism for me is really important. And, you know, New York City is a very interesting city. So are a lot of core industrial cities. They basically are running the show into the Gilded Age, into 1877 and 1920 at the very least. And I'm thinking about the Farmers Alliance movement, 1888 to 1896, which was actually mentioned earlier. You know, the farmers have very little in common with the workers in the cities. The farmers want inflation. The gold bugs are in the cities. Labor doesn't have much to do with the farmers. And so the next point would be that, do you see these change? I mean, Tammany is interesting, but the party system is more than New York City. It's more than New York City, and it's more than the urban politics, the Schefter type argument, which we're all beating around the bush here, which is actually machines teach you how to vote. I had a great grandfather that told me from Bronx, he voted 5-6 times a day, got paid for it too. That's New York, but that's not America. And so that would be question one. And the second really had to do with, and I want to tie it, is this idea of, I'm just trying to think, I don't want to go quick. I just lost my train of thought for a second here, which is, so we have to, let me just keep it simple. Does the Pendleton Act change, how am I want to put this, the nature of your argument as it relates to the fact that the financial aspects of New York City changed dramatically, I think, after 1886, 87, as you go into the McKinley wins, of course he gets shot, but we have the system of 96. McKinley wins because of the fusion between the populists and the Democrats. I mean, they moved to, what was it then? I mean, the Wall Street Journal had an article, Creeping Socialism from the West. That was the title of the farmers' movement, according to the Wall Street Journal hasn't changed very much in the last 150 years. They're worried about socialism. But so I guess my question really has to do with region, party systems, and whether or not too much emphasis is being placed on a pre-Pendleton Act New York City. I'll leave it there.
Why don't we get one more comment on the table, because we have Zach in the chat asking to ask a question, and then we'll let Jeff take up like 1 or 2 questions, Jeff. Don't try to answer all of them now, even though I know you'd probably be perfectly capable of that. So Zach, why don't you go ahead, and then there's some really excellent discussion in the chat too. So go ahead, Zach.
So first of all, congratulations, Dr. Broxmeyer, on your new book. It's been a pleasure taking some of your classes over the past couple years. So far, this discussion has really, for me, invoked a lot of the memories of the first year of the Trump administration. There was a lot of coverage over business conflicts of interest, and specifically regarding the Kushner family and a lot of the ways that they seem to be seeking to enrich themselves through politics. And so just broadly speaking, I'm sure this isn't limited to the Trump administration. What sort of implications over contemporary politics do you see the Gilded Age New York political party capital system manifesting today over 100 years later?
Renee, so I'll just speak to some of the questions then. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think so. Just take a few minutes, but remember we still have 30 other people in the room, so take a few minutes and see how concise you can stay for the moment. But I really want to hear some of your responses.
Well, let me just start by thanking the panelists and the people who have asked the questions in the audience so far. These are really probing questions. And I'm going to just be very candid and start by answering with, I'm going to think about this stuff because there's a lot to chew on here. But so to start with the first set of questions, in terms of periodization, And just the way in which I approached doing this particular set of materials was, at the time when I began the project, it's crazy to think about for me, but I began this over 10 years ago. This is what you're hearing is a process of about a decade of research and writing. And it began when I was in graduate school, trying to figure out how to get out of my program with a degree. And one of the ways in which I did that was I realized I couldn't do a comparative project because I didn't have the resources to. I was thinking about trying to compare New York with Paris and London in this period. And there's no way I could have done that without, with the resources I had. But what I did have at my disposal were archives that had some interesting strands in them locally. And so that was one of the reasons why I tried to pick up this particular case in New York, because for really practical reasons, I just could get on a train and go to the archive and start working through the materials. And so that's why New York, although I think that there is some real use to, this is not a completely self-enclosed party system in the way that you point out. It's a city that has two major parties, but there are just so many factions within those parties. And there are all sorts of independent movements and things like that. There's the scale of the state as well, which is hugely consequential, and then national politics that reverberates down into the state and in the city level. So to a certain extent, what I'm trying to do is just do something manageable here. And what I try and grasp onto are these periods where these factions manage to govern. And the way in which they're doing that is typically linking up some of these different forms of alliances across these different federal, state, and local levels. So the Tweed Ring, for instance, has a city and a state component to it. And the Conkling machine, the stalwart Republicans that follow them, they govern for about a decade. They're doing that primarily by ensconcing themselves at the federal level that reverberates into state politics, and then to a certain extent locally. And I'm just trying to find these things that are somewhat similar, where you have these large, unwieldy governing coalitions that are fused together through these party organizations, like the Tammany folks on the one hand and the stalwarts on the other. So to the extent that I'm looking at that stuff, it's because I think there's some comparison there that you can make. And I'm just trying to carve out a space that I can focus on so that I can then dig in a little bit into trying to uncover what the actual practices are, which is really tricky because as I mentioned in the beginning of the book in passing, one of the reasons why this period is so difficult to study and why all power politics is difficult to study just generally is these folks are covering their tracks. I mean, literally, Chester Arthur on his deathbed asks his son, I think it is, to burn his papers like right in front of him. And so we lose all sorts of really important documents. And then the extent to which you can try and find anything out otherwise, you're triangulating these little pieces of letters in all of these other archives that are related to, say, Morton Bliss and Company, for instance, which is this financial firm that ends up actually being really important for how Roscoe Conkling became wealthy, because he was not a wealthy guy. He was like a small town lawyer in Utica who then ended up becoming really quite wealthy. So that's part of the reason why I'm trying to just zero in on these kind of narrow periods. And so for Zach's question on contemporary politics, I've been really both frustrated and fascinated by the Trump years, in part because there's a lot of resonances in the way that Donald Trump organized his coalition through trying to build wealth. I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear, it seems like on a general level, but we don't know a lot of details about, is the way that he's coordinated a lot of collective action through his business, the Trump Organization. I mean, to a certain extent, you can kind of look at the parts that are publicly accessible, like say how campaign committees have spent money at, say, the Trump Hotel in DC or something like that. And you can see a kind of public record of that coalition building within the party, right? His kind of organizational structures. But ultimately, I mean, it's just going to be really tough to disentangle on a deeper level what a lot of those coalitions look like. But you could probably do it if you had like a lot of time and a lot of documents and maybe subpoena power and like all that kind of stuff. I think that people and scholars are going to have a lot to do going forward when they're thinking about the difference between, you know, there's a lot that's in the public record from, say, rhetoric, right? But then what is the power politics that goes on behind the scenes? And one way to disentangle that is to kind of look at through these alliances that can be built through making each other not only powerful, but rich as well. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I'm curious as well, as you know, other people might be.
Lucy had a question in the chat about Ohio municipal government seeing post-public servant capital accumulation, mainly in lobbying. And I was thinking about, her question also made me think about the difference between thinking about money and politics. And I was trying to talk about this with my students today because I'm teaching about neoliberalism. And thinking about money in politics and thinking about capitalism in politics, because capitalism is about profit and rent seeking. It's not just about money in politics, you know, and the circulation of money through politics and through the political system. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, whether or not post-public servant capital accumulation is whether you've thought about how this could scale up to someplace like Ohio, and also about that difference between the question of capitalism and just the more generic sort of typical way we talk about money in politics.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. It's great to see you, at least remotely. I hope that you're doing well. Lucy is a former student of the university and the department, so one of our star students. Thanks for that question. You know, I think that one of the challenges here is that these are different historical moments, entirely different historical periods. These are different states, right? But, you know, in the modern period, clearly there's a kind of revolving door, I guess, in the way that professionalism works, political professionalism. And I don't know if this work doesn't really speak to that so much, except as to say that the kinds of coalitions that were built in the book in a completely different historical period in a different place were really kind of long-term coalitions that that continued, you know, after people held office, but you could see in the kinds of private business dealings they were making. And so that might be a little bit different today because there are many more laws that say prohibit conflicts of interest in certain ways or try and create barriers, perhaps unsuccessfully, or lots of ways to get around that. But I think one of the things that I would say about that perhaps my book can speak to in a general way is that party leaders, however we think of that, made themselves into folks who could invest, right? It's not just kind of like a simple rent-seeking transaction that you can think of as, say, okay, you know, you're going to become a lobbyist and maybe have a large salary for an extended period of time, like maybe a few years or something like that, until your connections in government, you know, go away and maybe it loses its value or something like that. We think of that as kind of moments in time, as kinds of discrete rents, like say the salary that all of a sudden you're collecting, that's, you know, here one year and then gone another, after you transition into the private sector or something like that. But what I'd encourage people to think about is how there's really a mobility to capital that's different than, say, a fixed kind of thing if you're just looking at, say, a salary, right? And that's just a kind of different frame of thinking, in the sense that the rent is just a moment, right? Is a moment in time of this wider circulation that might be thought of differently than just say, oh, you disclosed, making $100,000 for a month of work for, something that you did for consulting for, a company or something like that. That's clearly kind of about some kind of political fix or something like that.
Jack, please go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
In the run up to the story about Big Six, Horace Greeley loses control of his own newspaper, and I'm wondering how consequential you think that episode is in terms of sort of greasing the wheels for Republican acceptance of what ends up becoming Jim Crow, or anything about how when Greeley's in control of the paper, it's that ever-present threat in American politics of putting the labor together with the cause of formerly enslaved people. Like, more on that, whatever you got, basically.
Thank you for, thank you for that question. And thank you for coming to the talk, Jack. So there's this moment in the end of the book where I'm trying to think about the consolidation of the party organization through the way that spoils end up being a really instrumental part of newspapers in the moment when newspapers are becoming more important for communication and just kind of agenda setting and justifying, say, the emerging corporate order. That's one of the big changes that the ownership of the New York Tribune, which was a major New York newspaper that had a really wide readership across the United States, and among the kind of original the original Republican kind of Civil War coalition of the farm labor, kind of free labor coalition. There's a real 180 that happens from the Greeley moment to Whitelaw Reid, who takes over the paper and turns it into a real strong voice in favor of the kind of financial machinations of Jay Gould and the industrialists and things like that. So your question, I think, is about the degree to which that's perhaps significant in its own as a kind of conjuncture that might have gone different ways. Is that kind of what you're... Yeah, that's a really good question. I suspect that this is one of the things that I found interesting and surprising in the research, where there's an election in 1884 and James Blaine is almost president. He's one of these guys that you've probably read about in the 19th century who ran a bunch. He's always trying to run for president. And if he had won New York, he might have been president. And there was this vigorous campaign against him to try and leverage the party as a whole, the national party, by a trade union to try and get union recognition within the New York Tribune. And it fails because Whitelaw Reid, who's the owner of the Tribune, but a close ally of Blaine, basically just completely ignores that and tries to kind of squash the trade union, which is Big Six, is the name of the trade union. That's a moment when things could have gone a different way, really, in terms of that election. But in terms of the larger significance of the kind of turn of the Republican Party away from a constituency that had been pretty influential within it, like artisans and native-born workers who were in trade unions, for instance, or proto-trade unions, which is a kind of part of the party that becomes less influential into the 1880s and 1890s. I don't think that that necessarily would have stopped any long-term trends of kind of the decline of the significance of labor within the Republican Party coalition. But it is a moment where you could see that that's a real parting of ways, just a really, really stark parting of ways. I mean, Horace Greeley was a quack in a lot of ways, but he was pro-labor, you know, in a kind of way that fit within the politics of the time, what that meant at the time, right? But I don't know if that particular incident changing would have changed the trajectory of the party at the national level, for instance, so much, because there were so many other forces that were just kind of overdetermined on the other direction, you know. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer though.
I'm not seeing any urgent calls in the chat for questions, so maybe we can ask Jeff to go back to discuss some of the questions that were raised by the discussants as well. The issues that I think it was Betsy raised about the relationship between fiscal politics and party politics was one sort of big one I took note of. And then whether, and you know, the sort of we so tend to, one of the things I really appreciated about the book was its resistance to the corruption paradigm, but you know, Jonathan's sort of pushing back on that and suggesting that we really do need to take it into account in the sort of mosh pit of party politics that you're describing, and maybe not resist it so strongly. So maybe a response to that. And then Rob sort of, I think, was asking similar questions to Andy, I think, about sort of the positioning of the research and its scalability and relationship to a larger system of party politics. But maybe you can respond to some of those issues.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll say I don't think I can resolve any of these questions now, other than to just say I'm going to think about this stuff. I mean, there are so many. One of the things that surprised me a bit was there really were a tremendous amount of commonalities between these different political parties, which had different constituencies and different social classes in different geographical, you know, parts of the city. They had different platforms, but there was a lot of commonality in how they organized themselves and their alliances, and especially in these moments when they were making cross-party alliances, which were beyond view. There's a whole faction of Tammany Republicans. Those are Republicans who make alliances with the Democrats, the Tammany Hall. And then there's actually a flip moment of that as well later on. And one of the things that I noticed was, so Tammany Hall, which is a democratic political machine, is really expansionary, right? They triple debt, they triple municipal debt in like 3 or 4 years. They're spending on everything, you know, parks, streets, everything that they can, as fast as they can write the checks, they're going out the door. And part of that is their patronage side, where they are trying to increase and proliferate the number of jobs they have at their disposal in order to put their loyalists into, right? So there's kind of like an active labor market policy there that Betsy, you know, mentioned. And the Republican side of that, they also were really expansionary in their kind of patronage politics in a way that was really similar, I found, to Tammany. But the Republican, you know, platforms and the way in which the party is, say, taking roll call votes on, say, monetary policy is just so different. I mean, they are contractionist, they are gold bugs, they're generally not, it's just like they have a completely different understanding on a kind of ideological and policy level of what they think of, you know, good government is for government spending generally. But their kind of organizational side, they are like flush. They're handing out jobs left and right as much as they can. And so there's a real disjuncture there. And that's one that I've tried to think through a little bit more, that hits a little bit on this question of, you know, the fiscal side of the state as opposed to the kind of political party organization and mobilization side. And I'm not sure that's something I ever kind of really fully reconcile, but I'll just note that seems to be something that's a disjuncture there. On the corruption side of the question, yeah, I take, you know, the problem, I would like to think that I take the problem of corruption seriously. It's really important to do that, I think, because, I mean, you're talking about, with politics, people's lives, right? And the problem of corruption is one that completely reverberates into questions of life and death, who gets listened to, and things like that. And if you go through the material in the things that people say, for instance, all sorts of people are talking about corruption. Everyone is talking about corruption. Tammany Hall thinks the Republicans are corrupt. The Republicans think Tammany Hall is corrupt. The elite reformers think everyone's corrupt. The people who are the grassroots critics in the labor movement especially think that everyone is corrupt, including this other group that they would add in, like the industrialists and stuff like that. And so I just found that not helpful as a framework, because it was really, I thought, more the kind of accusations of corruption really end up being a question of balance of power at a particular kind of moment, right? Who gets thrown in jail? Well, Tweed does. Tweed dies in jail, and he's basically given a death sentence because of the huge political mobilization against him. But these other figures who were involved in practically the same kinds of political machinations, they don't even go to jail. And so there has to be something that kind of explains that in a way that isn't like a moving target, that I found really difficult to kind of ground in any systematic analysis, which is why I go to kind of looking at patterns of political practices and ask, okay, well, did Tweed think he was corrupt? And let's be clear, he embezzled like just millions of dollars, right? But Tweed, I think it's pretty clear that Tweed considered himself a businessman, right? He's a man of business. And so this is actually how the Tammany office holders just self-describe themselves in the court filings when all the banks are going into receivership and they've got to, you know, defend themselves. So I think that also has to be taken seriously, right? These people thought of themselves self-consciously as kind of businessmen on the make. And then I think the third, Renee, what was the third thing that you had asked?
I think it was about the relationship between the New York City case study that you're doing here and the party system, the larger party system, and maybe that could also bring us to that question that someone raised about can we have political parties without electoral capitalism?
Ah, yeah.
Which I think it would be an awesome one to sort of begin to wrap up on.
Yeah.
Big one, and it's very contemporary. It's very contemporary. Can we do that?
Yeah. So I think that one possible answer to this is, if you look at the kind of practices at a micro level that I'm trying to do in terms of political behavior, you know, of these organizations that are kind of innovating these party businesses and things like that, I suspect, and I haven't done this kind of level of scrutiny for other places, except Nevada in this period, which looks a lot alike, but it's a territory. And so that's a bit different. I suspect that some of these state level party systems are going to look something similar to this case at certain moments in the same historical period, but on the whole, probably they're not, I think. But New York has a real outsized influence on the entire party system because of the way in which it's financing the canvas all over the country. I think that on the question of, is this the relationship between, say, electoral capitalism and party, and whether or not that's something that, say, is ever different in any other kind of time, or what it means for democracy. I suspect that things change in later periods, but really by small degrees. I mean, I suspect that the New Deal period is different, right? For some of the reasons that were mentioned before. Forget exactly who had mentioned that, the New Deal period, which is one of the reasons why this kind of political behavior has a lot more resonance with the neoliberal period after the 1970s, I think. And that's got a lot to do with the way in which the associational state and the submerged state and the way that kind of private power gets linked up to public authority in a way that's different in these periods than the New Deal period, suggests that we could periodize, I think, or look at recurring patterns almost. But on the question of, what electoral capitalism and party, is this just how things are, I think is kind of the question. In the US case, at least, political parties are expensive. Competition is really expensive. And people are constantly trying to figure out how to pay for things and get ahead. And in one of the ways, I mean, one of the big kinds of common themes across most of American political development, I'd say, is the struggle over resources, right? How are you going to pay for your political mobilization? And one of the things that these historical figures bring to the table is, well, we're going to start businesses, basically. And that's how we're going to pay for it. And that looks a lot like, I think, a lot of things that we see today, but probably not like things we saw maybe in national politics from the 30s to maybe the 70s, for reasons that have to do with the structure of the American state and the political economy more generally. But that's way beyond the scope of the book, I should add there, in terms of what I actually look at and the claims that I could empirically, claim have some rooting in evidence.
Any other questions out there before we begin to close up shop here? Any other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you very much, because it was a super interesting session. And Jeffrey, I think the work that you're doing, I'm going to read the book, and I have to confess I haven't, but I'm going to now. It's really very interesting. That's all I wanted to say. I don't want to take up any more time, but I just wanted to thank everybody, and especially for the invitation, Renee. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So glad you could be here.
Can I just say, I want to thank everyone, the people from the audience, and also the panelists. I just really appreciate your willingness to. I'm sorry, what did you say?
I'm sorry, I said also a nod to all the students that showed up too. There's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The students and former students. And I just want to say, I'm really appreciative of your time and your engagement. And if you are interested in reading a little bit more of the book, you can, if you're at a university, you can actually go to JSTOR. It's on JSTOR, the entire book, and you can access it there, all the chapters and the PDFs and stuff. Otherwise, it's a little bit of an academic book price. It's a little high in terms of the cost of a book, but the JSTOR, if you have a university access, you could check out the book that way for free through your university.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to read this book because it is so confidently written. And so I think it's kind of a role model for those of us who are thinking who get just out of control as we're writing and trying to get our thoughts down. I think Jeff has just done a magnificent job of staying very focused and being patient with the fact that he has to write another book to answer so many of the questions that this one inspired, which is just such a great academic strategy. I mean, it's just really good. And I'm really proud to have him in our department. So thank you all. I'm I'm just very, very pleased with how all of this has went in the discussion. And I've learned so much about how to read Jeff's book again, or when I look at it again, and how to think about his work going forward. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
You have a good night.
Good work.
Really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, Betsy, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the comments. Just so much to think through. And actually, I might, if it's okay, I've been scribbling on my pad here. And if it's okay, I might follow up with an email and just, if you wrote any comments down beforehand, I'd love to add those to my own notes, and just so I make sure not to miss any of those great questions.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for writing it.
Thank you for reading. Much appreciated.
Bye.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you, Jeff. This is very refreshing.
Oh, it's a real treat for me. And I'm going to run and go say goodnight to my kids because I think they just went to bed. So
good night, Jeff.
Yeah, good night.
Good night, John Boy. See ya.